Good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jared Ortiz. I teach Catholic theology in the religion department, and I'm the director of the St. Benedict Forum. Again, the St. Benedict Forum, for those of you who don't know, is a ministry of the local Catholic Church, St. Francis de Sales. We're the Catholic Spiritual and Intellectual Institute that serves Hope College and West Michigan. We're very grateful for all of our co-sponsors who have made tonight's event possible. Hope College's Religion Department, the Environmental Studies Program, and Geological and Environmental Sciences. We're also grateful to two Catholic foundations that are co-sponsoring this event. The wonderful Corpus Christi Foundation, based here in Holland, Michigan, and the Our Sunday Visitor Institute. We're very pleased to have Omar Gutierrez here to speak to us tonight about Pope Francis's latest encyclical on integral ecology and the Christian vision of the environment. Omar Gutierrez is the special assistant to the Archbishop of Omaha, George J. Lucas, and the manager of the Office of Missions and Justice. Mr. Gutierrez has a weekly radio program entitled Regnum Novum, the new evangelization through Catholic social teaching. He is a very busy author, writing for The Catholic Answer, the National Catholic Register, Catholic World Report, amongst others. And he's the author of a lovely little monograph called The Urging of Christ's Love, the Saints and the Social Teaching of the Catholic Church. Tonight, Mr. Gutierrez will speak on Praise Be to You, my Lord, how Christians should think about the environment. Please help me welcome Omar Gutierrez.
Starting out great. That was me coughing. Don't dare. Pardon me while I take a drink of water. Get myself ready. As Jared mentioned, I work for the Archdiocese of Omaha, Nebraska. So my wife and 4 kids and I drove up here from Omaha just a couple days ago. 4 kids, 10, 8, almost 5, and 2. Drove all the way here. So you can imagine how wonderful it is to be away from them right now. With all of you this evening. But we love our kids. And we love Holland, Michigan. I've actually been to Holland, Michigan before. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. No jokes, please. And I was in marching band in high school, and so I was part of your tulip festival. And it was about as miserable as today. That's my Holland, Michigan story. It was cold and rainy, and so I'm home again. You know, it's back in the good old days. What I wanted to do this evening was to just begin and talk about what an encyclical is, sort of contextualize what the Holy Father, Pope Francis, is coming from, what previous popes have said about the environment, and the context in which they said it, just very briefly going through that, and then talk about the document. The document, if you've had a chance to peruse it, is very long, so it's not for the light of heart exactly, but it's filled with beautiful nuggets of wisdom. So I can't go through all of it. I'm going to try to draw 3 major themes out of it that I think Pope Francis really wants us to take from the document and incorporate it into our lives. And so I'll get to those 3 in a second. But first, what's an encyclical, just very quickly, very easily. An encyclical is a circular letter the Pope sends to the bishops of the world. It's been the sort of fashion of the last few years since Pope St. John the 23rd to address it not just to the bishops, to all people of goodwill. But this is the first encyclical that Pope Francis, or any pope, has written that was addressed to the whole world specifically. At the beginning of the document, he doesn't even bother with sort of the tradition of addressing his brother bishops. He doesn't bother addressing anybody. He wants this to be for everyone. And he was very adamant about that from the beginning. Encyclicals are pretty authoritative in the sense that they're not infallible teaching, but the Pope wants what Catholics read from it, get from it, to be something they incorporate into their lives, into their belief and into their moral lives. And it's something generally considered that when it's a topic's addressed in an encyclical, it should be generally considered pretty settled issues. What have previous popes said on the environment? The environment and what the Church has said about the environment falls within the realm of Catholic social teaching, which is a branch of Catholic moral theology. There's actually a section in the Catechism, Catholic Catechism, on Catholic social teaching. Social teaching was a response to the realities of the 19th century, where the whole world found itself struggling with the craziness of the 19th century, revolutions in philosophy, with the Enlightenment and Hegelian dialectic and Nietzsche, revolutions in politics, with the various revolutions in Europe and elsewhere, and also revolutions, of course, with the Industrial Revolution. The way people understood truth and politics and economics changed vastly in a very short period of time. And the Church responded with Catholic social teaching. How does a Catholic begin to live their life as a Catholic in the midst of this new world that we find ourselves in? So thus started Catholic social teaching. The first instance then of the talk on the environment in the context of Catholic social teaching appears in 1971. Pope Paul VI, in a document, the Latin is Octogesimiad Veniens, which just means on the 80th anniversary. He has a couple of lines about the environment, basically saying that we are in danger of leaving for our children or for future generations a polluted environment. Nothing much more than that. But if you place yourself, back in the 70s, this was sort of the beginning of the movement, and some of you are too young to remember, but there was a famous, some of you aren't. I didn't want to point it out, but I'm glad you picked up on that. There was a famous ad campaign by Keeping America Beautiful, and with the Native American, it was famous. There were posters everywhere. It was the big thing, and the ad was this Native American fellow sort of going through the rivers and things, and there's pollution and black smoke in the background, and it ends basically with this Native American man with a tear going down his cheek, saying pollution starts with people, pollution ends with people. It was a very effective campaign, and that came out in 1971 as well. So it's the beginning sort of this awakening of environmentalism around this time. It's around this time also, I think, that the river in Cleveland caught on fire. So you get. I mean, I'm not joking. It caught on fire. So it was an interesting time. The Cuyahoga River, exactly. Lake Erie is lovely now. Cleveland's a great place to visit. That was sort of the beginning. It isn't until Pope St. John Paul II addresses it with greater specificity and more thought. Later, this is 1986, with the document Solicitudo Rei Socialis on social concerns. And here, John Paul II starts to talk about the environment in the context of the human person. He was a philosopher by training, and a theologian as well, but he was very much adamant about the human person, the dignity of the human person, and making sure that we understood things in the context of people, personalism. And so he begins to address the environment in the context of persons. He starts using this phrase, a human ecology. We require not just a natural ecology, but a human ecology as well. And I hope we can unpack some of that. And especially, I do want to leave a bit of time for question and answer and discussion this evening. So that's John Paul II. Pope Benedict XVI is his successor, and he's sometimes referred to, even in the secular media, as the Green Pope, because he spoke a great deal about the environment in his personal addresses and his encyclicals, and his great encyclical, Charity and Truth, which came out in 2009. He spends a good portion of it talking about the environment, and again bringing up this language of a human ecology. And in the context as well of bioethics and technology, etc., he addresses a number of those things in several paragraphs in that document. But Laudato Si, which comes to us from Pope Francis, is the first encyclical just devoted only to the environmental questions. And some people ask, why now? Why is the Holy Father, Pope Francis, is addressing this? In part, I think it's very much because of who he is as a man, as someone who has come out of Latin America, as Argentinian, and as someone who has cared very deeply and very personally for the poor. In the United States, we don't always get this sense. I mean, Lake Erie and Cuyahoga River are really quite nice now. We have the kind of wealth in our nation to be able to address some of these issues in a way that other countries can't. And so these questions in the environment affect the poor in other nations in ways we don't even see most often. And so it may not always strike us as that adamant an issue, but for the poor and elsewhere in the country, certainly, elsewhere in the world, it certainly is. So that's sort of the lead-in up to this time. Pope Francis is not necessarily really breaking any new ground with this document. He is, in the sense, that it's the first one devoted just to this, and his tone and his style are certainly new and unique to him, and we love him for it. But he's really sort of taking what the previous popes have said and bringing it into a new package, as it will, so that it's more accessible to the rest of us. And so I want to talk about what he's bringing forward in three basic points. Right? It's a huge document, but 3 basic points. The first of them, my first point, is that we cannot help the environment if we don't understand the human person. We cannot help the environment if we don't understand the human person. The second point is that the way we treat things affects the way we treat people, and vice versa. The way we treat things affects the way we treat people, and vice versa. And finally, the ultimate answer that Pope Francis offers us to these problems of the environment and so on and so forth is an encounter with God and conversion. Pope Francis is a preacher. He's a Jesuit. Right? He's a missionary man who's about converting. Right? So the Jesuits are there for is to convert the world to this God-man who died for us. So an encounter with God and conversion. So we'll go through each of those and I'll unpack those. The first one, we cannot help the environment if we don't understand the human person. In paragraph 118, and some of these quotes are in your handouts this evening, in 118 the Holy Father writes, "There can be no renewal of our relationship with nature without a renewal of humanity itself. There can be no ecology without an adequate anthropology." No ecology without adequate anthropology. What's he trying to say there? Essentially, it's very difficult for us to even begin to have the conversation about how to properly address environmental concerns unless we're starting from the same point when it comes to who the human person is, what the human person is, what does the dignity of the human person demand of everyone, etc. To help try to explain what the Holy Father is trying to communicate, I decided to use a poem, because poetry, I think, is a lost art in many ways. And poetry, the power of poetry is it can communicate so much in so few words. And I wanted to pick this poem by Rudyard Kipling, "The Gods of the Copybook Headings." Now, just a little bit about the poem to understand where I'm going for, and this is kind of a trip into my own head, so I'm sorry. But the poem, when English schoolboys were supposed to practice their handwriting by copying aphorisms into their copybooks. And so in that way they would practice their handwriting, but they would only memorize also these proverbs and aphorisms that would come from anywhere, the kind of basic wisdom that is part of humanity throughout human history, whether it's from Indochina or from the Aboriginals of Alberta, Canada. It's all, there's a certain basic understanding of wisdom that all humanity sort of carries along with it. Things like the idle man is the devil's handyman, right? Things like that. Right? So they would do this. So when Kipling writes this poem, the gods of the copybook headings represent tradition. They represent basic human wisdom. They represent proverbs, the natural law, if you will. Now, in the poem, the gods of the copybook headings are juxtaposed against the gods of the marketplace. And not so much because Kipling was a socialist, but because he understood that the marketplace can be untethered, right? And when untethered, when not connected to the gods of the copybook headings, it can become dangerous. So I'm going to read to you one of the stanzas here. When I say Stilton, that's a reference to the cheese. So it's a nice blue cheese. But here's the stanza. "With the hopes that our world is built on, they were utterly out of touch." And the they there is the gods of the copybook headings, tradition, right? You hear this, the church is out of touch or whatever. So with the hope that our world is built on, they were utterly out of touch. They denied that the moon was Stilton. They denied she was even Dutch. They denied that wishes were horses. They denied that a pig had wings. So we worship the gods of the market who promise these beautiful things. What Kipling is trying to tell us, and Pope Francis says this in a number of various ways in the encyclical, is that there's something wrong in us as human beings. Right? We love to be told things that we know can't possibly be true. We love to be told they can be true and they can be ours. All you need to do is wish upon a star, and your dreams will come true. You can be anything and anywhere you ever want, and all you have to do is want it enough. We love to be told these things, and the marketplace is there to tell us we can have it all. We can consume, and we can buy, and we can do anything we want, and there's never any consequence for anybody else. Right? And you'll only get smarter and taller and handsomer. And you'll lose weight and all sorts of wonderful things. This is what the marketplace tells us. And so despite all this, right, despite even though there's this voice behind us, the voice of the gods of the comic book headings, the voice of our grandmothers and grandfathers, who are telling us, if it's too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. We want to listen to the gods of the marketplace. We want to listen to those who tell us we can have it all. And what Pope Francis says in many different ways in the encyclical is we have to realize that technology and financial markets are not going to be able to answer all our problems. Simply can't, and we're fooling ourselves if we can. One of the results, or one of the reasons why we listen to the gods of the marketplace, we listen to this insistence that we can have everything we want, is because of something St. Augustine talks about in the Confessions. And I hope if you haven't read it, you will at some point. There's the famous scene in Confessions where Augustine is a young man, he's 16, and he steals into a friend's vineyard to get some pears, which is this famous pear tree scene. And he and his buddies are there, and Augustine writes that the reason he was attracted first to the pear tree was because it was part of creation. He actually says this. It was because you created it, O Lord. It was beautiful to me. But his buddies, his 16-year-old guy friends, weren't there to wax philosophical on the beauty of a pear tree. Right? They wanted to destroy it. So they stole the pears, but they also they shook the tree. And I had these images of these young boys throwing pears at the highest pears in the tree, just to get all the pears off. And then once they're all on the ground, Augustine tells us they picked them up and they didn't eat them. This wasn't about eating. They weren't hungry. They threw them to the swine. It was just about like little boys do. I have, the 2 and 4. It's like a boy taking a stick against a flower. It's just they wanted to prove something. Now Augustine, years later, is thinking about this in the Confessions and wondering, why did I do this? And Augustine says, I did it because I knew it was wrong. He said, I did it because I knew it was wrong and I could get away with it. And he said, and it gave me, and these are his words in translation actually, but it gave me a deluded sense of omnipotence. Deluded sense of omnipotence. A sense that I was all-powerful, that I could have it all, that I was in complete control of my own destiny. As previous popes have said, and as Pope Francis says a number of times, technology and financial markets are simply tools or forms of socio-human activity. Technology has a user behind it, or an inventor who's a human person. And markets aren't some magical force, they're people. We are the market. Persons. So where are we and how are we encountering the persons involved in this equation? That's what the Holy Father is trying to get us to see. In other words, behind the technology are all these persons like you and me. And so these are not autonomous mechanisms that function under their own mystical powers. And this is very important to understand because as you're struggling to try to maintain this omnipotence for ourselves, there's this attitude in our culture which is very, very dangerous, in which Pope Francis says is at the root of all our environmental and social problems. And I have this quote for you. It comes from paragraph 6. But Pope Francis is actually quoting Pope Benedict XVI. But he says this a number of different times, that at the root of all the problems, ecological problems, and social ills that we face, the root of all these problems is the notion that there are no indisputable truths to guide our lives, and hence human freedom is limitless. And he says elsewhere, relativism. At the root of these problems, environmental and social, is relativism. The idea that there is no right or wrong. When I mentioned that ad before about the Native American fellow with the tear, right? The reason that ad worked as well as it did is because the marketers presumed that the audience, us, cared enough about other people, cared enough about the tradition of the Native Americans and their respect for the environment of the United States, that we cared enough to want to change the way we behaved to care for our land. And they were right, thankfully, in many ways. But that's not always true, sadly. There is a right and a wrong. Pope Francis says in paragraph 123, we should not think that political efforts or the force of law will be sufficient to prevent actions which affect the environment, because when the culture itself is corrupt and objective truth and universally valid principles are no longer upheld, then laws can only be seen as an arbitrary imposition or obstacle to be avoided. We could pass all the environmental laws we want to, internationally even, as he asks for in the document. But what will it matter if there's no such thing as right or wrong? There's no such thing as truth. If your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth, then never the twain shall meet. This is the heart of the problem of the ecological and human conundrum. So this moral relativism, says Pope Francis, then is the rot that exists within our culture, and this is our state of things. So those who place their hope in technology and markets, which are really just people, while forgetting the human condition, are fooling themselves. And more importantly, this attitude of omnipotence affects the way we treat our neighbor, which leads me to the second point. So the first point, we need to understand the nature of the human person. We need to understand these pulls, these temptations that are realities in our lives. The second point, the way we treat things affects the way we treat people, and vice versa. In paragraph 116, Pope Francis writes that an inadequate presentation of Christian anthropology gave rise to a wrong understanding of the relationship between human beings and the world. The result, he says, again from paragraph 123, is, quote, the culture of relativism is the same disorder which drives one person to take advantage of another, to treat others as mere objects, imposing forced labor on them or enslaving them to pay their debts. This same use and throw away logic generates so much waste because of the disordered desire to consume more than what is really necessary. This attitude of we can have whatever we want translates then into a habit of treating people as means to an end. If I can have whatever I want, if that's what the marketplace demands, if that's what the marketplace tells me is the symbol of my success and happiness, then any person who gets in the way of that, right, is no longer important in my mind. It's an obstacle to my being able to get to what the marketplace has told me I can have. Relativism leads to consumerism, which leads to a throwaway culture. And the Holy Father is trying to tell us that living more simply is not just about saving the environment, although it obviously is, right? But it's also about saving our souls. It's also about saving our souls. Again, he's not necessarily the first person to say this. Pope St. John Paul II said the same thing many years ago. I think it was 1987 with Familiaris Consortio, the document he wrote on the role of the Christian family in the modern world. And in that book, he's describing these sort of four signs for the Christian family. And the family, he says, needs to be open to life, and this openness to life involves education. And he says the root of the education is parents need to teach their children the proper relationship between people and things. That's what he says is the very root of it, the proper relationship between people and things. And Pope John Paul II says the way we do that is by living simple and austere lifestyles that teach our children that people are more important than things. That's St. John Paul II. Why? Right? Because we're creatures of habit. Right? This is part of human nature as well. We're creatures of habit. The more we're in the habit of treating things as something we can simply use and throw away, the more likely we are, more habituated we are to treating people in the exact same way. In lots of different ways. My father-in-law is a convert to Catholicism, and he's 94 now, God bless him. the former philosophy professor, and his mind is still quick as attack. And I remember him visiting us many years ago. This is a man who lived through the Great Depression. He's from Canada, and lived through the Great Depression. And still to this day, we won't talk about those days growing up in Canada. He grew up in a poor family. But I remember I was offering him. He is slightly diabetic, and his wife lets him have one beer every day, which is like the best moment of his whole day. He's Canadian, so it's like it's got to be good Canadian beer. So it's this great moment. I get to hand him my wife's father this beer, and he was sitting on our futon, which we got when I was early married or college or something. I don't even know where the thing came from, but it's made partly of wood. It's probably fake wood of some sort. So, but he asked for a coaster, and I said, well, don't worry, it's cheap, whatever. And I'll never forget the look he gave me. He said, no, but it's yours. It may be cheap, but it's yours. This attitude of treating things as though they're simply something to throw away, that can bleed into so many other areas of our lives. And we can begin to treat people that way. If we're in the habit of using and throwing away things, we're more likely to throw away people. And this is what the Holy Father is asking us to do. When Pope John Paul II uses this phrase, human ecology, then, which is a phrase then used by Benedict XVI and used by Pope Francis, what he's trying to get us to understand is when we think about an ecosystem, we think of a system that with counterbalances and things that sort of feed into each other in a sort of cyclical, natural way. What the popes have been saying is that we want a human ecology, a culture, in other words, that helps to balance out our lives, and that is itself also somewhat natural, so that we can appreciate the beauty in each person for who they are, as ends in themselves instead of as means to an end, instead of a happiness for something in the future. That, along with, of course, the fact that there's only so much stuff to go around. That when we treat things as though they are limitless, we can begin again to treat people that way. But the facts are that things aren't limitless. There's a finite amount of goods on this planet. And so it only makes sense, as the gods of the copybook headings would tell us, right? It only makes sense then that we try to reduce our consumption, reuse that which we can reuse, and recycle that which we can recycle. Again, from Kipling's poem, then the gods of the market tumbled, and their smooth-tongued wizards withdrew, and the hearts of the meanest were humbled, and began to believe it was true, that all is not gold that glitters, and 2 and 2 makes 4. And the gods of the copybook headings limped up to explain it once more. They don't go away, and Pope Francis is again here to sort of tell us, look, this is common sense, this is wisdom. We need to live more simply, right? Not just because it will actually help reduce what we use and keep more of the limited finite goods here for the future generations, and that's important, but also because for our souls, also because this affects the way we treat other people. All right. Now, the third point. We ultimately need an encounter with God who loves us. In paragraph 224, Pope Francis writes, it is not easy to promote this kind of healthy humility or happy sobriety, this living simply, right? When we consider ourselves autonomous, when we exclude God from our lives or replace him with our own ego and think that our subjective feelings can define what is right and what is wrong. There's the reference to relativism again. It's much harder for us to argue for the caring of the other when we don't believe there's a right and wrong to begin with. In paragraph 119, Pope Francis writes that a correct relationship with the created world demands that we not weaken the social dimension of openness to others, much less the transcendent dimension of our openness to the thou of God. Our relationship with the environment can never be isolated from our relationship with others and with God. If you want to care for the environment, says Pope Francis, you need to be able to help care for your neighbor, care for those around you, and that care will begin to become part of you when you enter into the dialogue with God, with the God who cares so deeply for us, with the kind of God who's willing to send his only Son to suffer and die for us. That's the kind of God we have. the encounter with the Christian God changes the way we live and how we relate to the truth. Pope Francis writes in paragraph 222, he says, Christian spirituality proposes a growth marked by moderation and a capacity to be happy with little. You think of the Christian tradition, the evangelical counsels of poverty, and the great impression that St. Francis, right, sort of the founder of this mendicant movement in the Middle Ages, through poverty, through living simply, so that others could simply live, as the line goes. This is part of Christian spirituality, and the Holy Father mentions one saint in particular that we could follow to help us do this. And actually, he doesn't mention he mentions St. Francis a number of times, but in this particular spot, he references St. Therese of Lisieux, the little flower. For those of you who don't know, she was a French a young woman. She died at the age of 24, very young. She had wanted to become a missionary and go be martyred for the Christian faith. But God didn't call her to that. He called her to a cloister in France. She lived in seclusion praying for the rest of us for all her short life. But she came with this beautiful spirituality, which is often referred to as the little way of St. Lucia, the little flower. And this little way, Pope Francis actually mentions. It's in that quote there toward the bottom of the page, number 9. St. Therese of Lisieux invites us to practice the little way of love, not to miss out on a kind word, a smile, or any small gesture which shows peace and friendship. An integral ecology is also made up of simple daily gestures which break with the logic of violence, exploitation, and selfishness. In the end, a world of exacerbated consumption is at the same time a world which mistreats life in all its forms. This spirituality is calling us to the spirituality that doesn't require that we become St. Francis and sell everything, right? Strip naked to the square and renounce everything our Father ever gave us. Right? That's not what he's asking. That's necessarily what the Lord may be calling us to do. It can be simply as simple as this. Right? Live where the Lord has you in love, and do every little thing with the love and for the love of Christ Jesus. And it's very important, as Pope Francis says in many other places. We don't confuse this with a kind of general humanitarianism. Right? Somebody can give up everything and move to Africa and care for the poor. You don't need to be a Christian to do any of it. Right? Christopher Hitchens, who died recently, the famous sort of evangelical atheist, if you will, Hitchens was always very offended by the notion that just because he was an atheist, he didn't have morality. So that's an offense to my humanity, and he's right. It is an offense to his humanity. You can be a very moral person and be an atheist. But the distinction here, of course, is that the motivation for why we do the things we do is out of love for Christ Jesus. And while it may even look the same as it does for others, it's coming from that happiness with being happy with little, as Pope Francis says. That's the heart of this Christian spirituality. And he's wonderfully practical in a number of places. Maybe we can talk about this more in discussion time, but he's wonderfully practical. He actually gives the example of, he says, if you find yourself in a position where you're wealthy enough to afford a hotter home, right, turn down the thermostat and put on a sweater, right? And he says, and that's the beginning of the spirituality. That's the beginning of the spirituality, of being able to sacrifice in that moment, doing that little thing in love, right, for the sake of the Lord and for the sake of the kingdom. Pope Francis, in this encyclical, asks us to rethink the way we have the conversation of the environment, I think along the lines of what does this mean for human persons, always. He calls us to sort of a baseline understanding of a sort of common sense natural law. We need to care for each other. It's commonsensical. We only have so much around us. We need to use it wisely, right? But he doesn't leave us there. He wants to connect us always with the God who is love, with the God who calls us to communion with him in our heavenly home here, in our common home, but also in our heavenly home up in heaven. That's the introduction, and I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about here in discussions, but I'd love to take any of your questions or comments, please. Yes?
How do you think the American church is going to address this and begin to, in quotes, teach this to parishioners?
I think that she'll do that by continuing to emphasize that fundamental dignity of the human person. As Pope Francis is saying, I don't think you can separate this question of the environment from the question of that dignity of the human person. And so as the church is asking us to consider, I was just thinking of this the other day, let's take something like pornography, right? When we look at something like pornography, where you're actually looking at somebody as an object, right? When we preach against that, right? When we encourage people to rethink the way they view that in their life, we're leading them to the position where they might be able to begin to change their life and view people as persons, and so then may be able to take care of the environment as well. I think it's one of the things he says constantly in this. He says it probably 8 times. He says everything is interconnected. He says it over and over and over again. So I think there are ways, some bishops, for instance, are choosing to be more vocal about the environmental question, calling people to reduce their consumption, calling, taking steps even in their own chanceries or in parishes to do environmental audits, how their parishes can be more efficient. I know in my archdiocese, the Archdiocese of Omaha, we've looked at doing that with the structures we have, the old structures we have, trying to be more efficient. So there are concrete things to do there. But within the parish, when you're talking to moms and dads who are spending so much time just trying to make ends meet and driving kids to practices, oftentimes you just start with the simple things, I think, of trying to get them to realize the connection between the way they treat people and this question of the environment as well. Thank you. Yes?
I don't seem to recall that when this encyclical was issued that there was much sort of ecumenism. The Pope didn't seem to reach out to our brothers and sisters in the Protestant faith. Did I just miss that? And he did sort of attempt to align other Christian groups around this, or did that kind of not happen? And if it didn't happen, why do you think it didn't?
I think there's an answer yes and no.
It's a bigger issue than just a Catholic issue.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I think in the United States, the way it was talked about wasn't really connected with other denominations very much. I didn't see that very much in my archdiocese. But the Holy Father is nothing if he's not ecumenical, and I know from his point of view, he does often reach out to Protestants and others to talk about this issue, mentioning a number of ways, and that was in fact one of the, I think, reasons why this document was addressed in the way it was, that he didn't want it to be seen as merely a Catholic document. He was addressing it to the whole world, and he made it really quite clear that he wanted to address everyone. And in the end of the document, actually, he has 2 separate prayers, one that could be prayed by anybody, and one that could be prayed by Catholics. For the explicit purpose of mentioning this isn't just a Catholic issue, this is a wider issue we all need to be working on together. Now, obviously the Pope doesn't have control about what local dioceses may do or how the media may talk about it, so I can't speak to why perhaps it was missed here, but he certainly made it a great point to reach out to others on this issue. Yes?
I have a 2-part question. One, why Omaha? How did you get connected with this, and how did it become a passion for you to speak to it? And then secondly, getting insight into the type of people that surrounded him to help him develop this.
So why Omaha and why me? No, so I ended up in Omaha just so I've been working for the church for about 13, 14 years. My background's in theology, and it's been specifically with Catholic social teaching. And with Catholic social teaching, because in that sort of branch of Catholic theology you have all the great sexy topics, right? Economics and politics and and all those great things sort of wrapped up in one, in God and everything. So in the environment and environmentalism touches on all those things. What I love about the Holy Father's approach is that he's right, everything is interconnected. And so the environment helps bring in, this question of the environment, environmentalism helps bring in this very fundamental question, which is actually why I think it's such a popular notion today, is, especially I think for our young people, is that it was really sort of where the rubber hits the road. If you believe in what you say you believe, how is that going to reflect in the way you behave, right? And how you live your life? And that's what we're all, I think, hopefully searching for. And the environment and how we consume, it really makes it tactile and real. So that's why I'm interested in the topic, and that's why I think it's part of Catholic social teaching, and that's why I like talking about it, because it's a forum for a great discussion. Who influenced the Holy Father? I can't necessarily speak to that. Some of that stuff is secret, actually, so we don't know exactly who did it. We know, though, that he did invite some of the leading climate scientists from the world to come speak to him, theologians on various issues, folks as disparate as Cardinal Mueller, who's the sort of the head of the Congregation of Doctrine and Faith, considered conservative, if you want to use that language. I don't, but from that end, as well as people who are more liberal as well. So he's the kind of pope who really loves to bring people around and get all the perspectives to be able to provide his viewpoint. Yes?
Say some more about integral ecology. Appears in the document many times.
Sure.
Some people say it's sort of the central idea. Say some more about that.
Sure. So again, with this idea that everything is interconnected, the word integral, and this is a word that Pope Benedict XVI actually introduces into Catholic social teaching a great deal, with this idea that we're looking at, let's say, a Christian life that understands we're not machines. You can't simply remove things as though they're a cog and expect the machine to continue to work. Integral suggests that every aspect of our life is organic and needs to be able to fit into the larger whole. So an integral ecology then means that we can't simply focus on this one issue of renewables, let's say. We also have to ask the questions about how are we treating people in the labor force, and how are we treating people in other areas of the markets, because all of these things are integral. They all create a culture, an ecology, right, that either advances the fundamental dignity of the human person or doesn't. Right? And so if we begin to view top to bottom every aspect of our life with that paradigm of the dignity of the human person, then we begin to be able to integrate the different parts of the culture, the ecology, one into the other, and so have a holistic approach. Yes, sir?
It seems like the media, in the United States, got a hold of the message, and you did a really great job presenting it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes. Thank you.
What I heard from the media was it's man-made global warming, that sort of thing,
Mhm.
right? And then I didn't really hear anything from the U.S. Catholic bishops to kind of balance that story. And our parish in Grand Rapids, our parish in Holland, the priest didn't stand up and say, "What are you guys going to do about this?" I mean, so there seems to be the message came out, and then that was it.
Yeah, it's a struggle. So one of the interesting things is sort of inside baseball stuff, but I was impressed by how proactive, the Vatican was in providing Catholic dioceses with talking points and views of how to express this document before it ever even came out. And then the document came out, and it wasn't other than what we had been given, but it's really very long. And it was very difficult to try to wrap one's head around it and be fair to every aspect of it in order to present it. Yes, the media focused on that because the media does what the media does, always sort of focus on the things that grab the headlines. The Holy Father does talk about that in paragraphs 23 and following, and he talks about it very honestly and very forthrightly. But he talks about it in 3 or 4 paragraphs of 200 and some odd paragraphs. So I encourage you to go read that, and it's important. We shouldn't dismiss it. The fossil fuels do create these problems, and we need to deal with that and consume less and all the rest of it. But the main message here, again, is not to focus in on the one thing. It's considered the entire whole, that all these things connect one with the other. And we can't pretend that, that just because we care about this one particular issue that we have no responsibility toward all the others. Now, as for what priests can do at the pulpit, I would encourage all pastors to talk about what you sort of suggest is what can we do. And there's some really some wonderful toward the end here, some wonderful things he says and suggests. You know, I mentioned the thing about putting on a sweater, but even again things like what kind of media are you taking in? You know, Pope Benedict said that when you engage in the market, when you pay $1, you're voting. Right? When you give someone your money, you're affirming them for what they're doing. And the opposite is true here. So Pope Francis actually, I think, is the first pope in an encyclical to encourage people to boycott. Right? Boycott. Right? Engage with the culture. Create a human ecology in our culture, and allow what you say you believe in your faith to affect where you place your money, where you buy things, who you're buying them from. If there's a corporation that's undermining the fundamental dignity of the human person, then don't participate in that corporation, and let them know why. Those are the beginning steps, I think, but it can't just end there, because that can become its own sort of boutique spirituality as well. I feel good in myself because I'm a Christian, so I'm boycotting so-and-so. Right? It can't just be that either. It also has to go deeper, and so I'd encourage pastors all to talk about, picking up St. Therese's, a book on I Believe in Love, right? Reading St. Francis de Sales, engaging in the spiritual life, because the spiritual life is part of that integral ecology that we all have to be part of as well. And maybe I could tie that in a bow and say, be a saint. Do what St. Paul tells us, pursue saints.
So when the media questioning, so this encyclical, at least in America, was met with great suspicion, especially amongst traditionally faithful Catholics who are usually kind of pro-Pope, right? But it does this thing on the environment. It's like, whoa, so it kind of hit our American politics, and
that's true.
Kind of at an angle here. But the concerns that I think some of the faithful Catholics I thought brought to that, some of them were legitimate, was that there are these strands in the environmental movement that are misanthropic.
Right, yeah.
That are actually contrary to Catholic teachings and things like that. Does Pope Francis address those strands in the environmental movement that are perhaps at odds with this integral ecology that he's talking about?
Yeah, I think so. So just the misanthropic strands, there are those strands within the environmental movement that see the problem of the environment as being people, right? The problem is people. There are too many people, or it's not the right kind of people, whatever it might be. In fact, there was, which I was thinking about this the other day, there was, I don't know if you caught this, this was probably 5-6 years ago, somebody had broken into the Discovery Channel headquarters with the bomb and intending to blow it up, and thankfully they stopped him. But when they looked at his manifesto, he said that there were just too many people in the world. We need to get rid of people. Right? We need to simply allow people to start dying, and so on and so forth. It was a sad, but the man definitely had some mental health issues. So I don't fault him for that. But the reason I bring it up is because it was just about a week or two later that someone writing for the Financial Times of Canada, writing about the environment, they were having an environmental meeting in Europe, said they can talk about all the environmental things they want, but we all know what the answer is, and the answer is a worldwide one-child policy. That's the answer. That's going to fix it. So there is this strand. Right? What the Holy Father says is that can't be the answer. Right? That does not build a human ecology. That begins to see, again, people as objects which we need to manage in order to fix a problem. It's a technocratic, uses that language, technocratic answer. It's not a holistic, it's not an integral answer to the problem, I don't think. And he also talks about, one of the things he mentioned specifically and strongly condemns, oddly, I was kind of surprised with the language, was carbon offsets. He says that it can lend itself to kind of speculation and a financialization. And carbon offsets, so if you don't know, or if you take a flight from New York to LA, you're adding to the carbon footprint here in the United States. So to offset the damage you've done to the environment, you could pay for, let's say, 80 trees to be planted in Canada or something like that to offset the carbon thing. But there are some outfits, for instance, who will allow you to pay for the sterilization of women in third world countries as your offset. Right? So again, it sort of breeds this notion that the problem is people, right? And certain kinds of people, so the Holy Father condemns that attitude, I think, roundly. Yes.
Is there any plans for sort of a follow-up on this encyclical, just because of the fact that when this was released, immediately the media on the left and the right latch onto the words global warming.
Right.
Right? Nobody hears anything
Yeah.
after those two words, because
Exactly.
you're either a believer that it's man-made or it's a hoax.
Right.
And that is really how it was framed. And I have certainly not read all of the encyclical, just little bits and highlights and stuff. And it's so much richer than just
Yes.
man-made global warming. You're
Exactly.
talking about a whole ecology, care.
Yes.
So having said that, and certainly Pope Francis must have known that was going to be the result, right? So is there any follow-up planned, or not as a stepping back from this, but more like, no, look, let's look at it this way.
Yeah.
Does that ever happen?
Yeah, you give a lot of credit to the church, and I appreciate it.
Well, I'm a new Catholic, so high hope.
It's the perennial problem. When Pope St. John Paul II wrote Centesimus Annus on the 100th anniversary of Catholic social teaching, and he meant it to be really the sort of touchstone document of Catholic social teaching, and said, I really want my bishop. He was so frustrated that nothing happened. He actually went out and he started his own sort of lay organization called Centesimus Annus Pro Pontifice, separate from the Vatican curial offices, right? Because he's like, I want something completely outside the Vatican, so just connected to me, and not having to deal with the just to get the word out about this teaching. So that's how he dealt with it. Pope Francis, I think, will not have a follow-up, just in the sense that there's not going to be, I think, more on this specific topic, apart from what he says in his audiences, what he's going to encourage people to come when bishops come and speak. There's ad limina visits, and they come and visit him. He might mention this in terms of something he wants them to focus on in their dioceses. He's used the papal nuncios very wisely. In the state of Nebraska, for instance, where I'm from, we were just able to repeal the death penalty, and that came up on the radar. And so our Archbishop got a note from the papal nuncio saying the Holy Father understands that this vote is coming up, and he wants you to know, he wants you to stand for the Church's teaching and appreciates all the work you have to. So this is how he works, right? But more than that, I think within the Catholic Church, there's always kind of the sense from the outside that there's sort of this top-down hierarchy thing, but really the desire of my Archbishop and so many other bishops is that the laity sort of take up the call. That the
So
document
he
is
plants
there.
the seed and then...
Yeah, exactly. The document is there, the seed is there, the language is there, and it's been there for a while. And this is the great encouragement to take. I mean, even something as simple as to take my devotion to the little flower and turn it into something I can use to help shape other people towards the environment. Those are the kinds of things I think he would love to see from us, right? From you. There's that famous scene, St. Catherine Drexel, who was a wealthy heiress who was shocked by the state of the Native Americans and African Americans in the United States in the 1800s, and went to go see Pope Leo XIII and said, really the church needs to do something about these poor people in the Americas. And Pope Leo XIII said, yes, you should. And so then she ended up, founding an order and founding these universities and so on and so forth. So yeah.
I think too, back to a term that's been used a lot as we've gone through this ecologies, think globally but act locally.
Locally, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
So we all need to.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's a very good point. The tendency sometimes, at least for me, is to try to think of, these big picture things, while at the same time I have little habits in my own life that I can begin to be addressing immediately, right? That I actually do have control over, right? But may not be as glitzy or as emotionally fulfilling. Right? It might actually require some sacrifice from myself. Thank you.
The sweater is okay.
A sweater's grand. Yeah. Maybe two.
So
Yes.
you kind of mentioned this idea about sacrifice, but how do you think that we can tell people that it really isn't about sacrificing? I mean, it's just kind of making minor changes, and it's not going to affect your life in this huge manner, but it's just little things that add up and make a big difference.
Right. I think that's true. I think sometimes what causes a lot of us to sort of balk at any kind of real changes is the fear of what it will mean. This is true of the spiritual life, right? Jesus is the great cookie monster who's going to take away everything from me. In reality, he wants to show us how much he loves us. And in that love for him, then I'm only too glad to get rid of things, right? Nevertheless, the saints talk about it as a purgation. The saints talk about it as something, I am giving something up. But I'm happy to do so, but I am losing something. So I don't think we want to shy away from that language. I think we want to be honest with people and say to them, yeah, it is a sacrifice, but it's something that you'll be able to lean into and grow from. Again, not because, and this is a good point, I'm glad you brought this up, not because I'm engaging in my will to force myself to do this thing. Anybody can do that. What Pope Francis is asking is that out of love for Christ and the desire to be closer to him, we be willing to sort of let go of these aspects of our life, which will be sacrifices, but happily so. Right? Because they draw us closer to the one who said that when you do this for the least of these, you do it for me. Yes, sir.
I remember the commercial you referred to
Yes.
in 1971, and I was taking my first macroeconomics course then. And so I asked my professor what he thought of it, and this notion of live simply so that others may simply live. He says, horrible idea. You know what that would do to capitalism? And went on and on, talking about what all capitalism has done for the West, and all the fact that we're living much longer lives, and all kinds of good things, not necessarily bad.
No.
What do you say to a professor like that?
Yeah, I would say, look, so, talking about economics in the 70s, and E.F. Schumacher was an economist,
yeah,
right? Small is beautiful.
Small is beautiful, yeah, right.
And so what I would say is, look, the capitalist system, the free market system, is a system that allows us to be small, right? That allows us to live simply, that allows us to use the market to advance our own moral worldview. That's the wonder of it. Is it's not baked into the system that it has to be this way or that. We can make it our own in a certain sense, based on our own morality. And so I think it would be wrong to say that the goal of any economic system is to produce these numerous or numerical results. The goal is the advancement of society, the advancement of human persons. And I don't think capitalism is inimical to that, and so I would just agree with him that it's an either-or proposition.
You can have a healthy economy and still live simply.
Absolutely. Or at least we can try, right?
I think
Yeah. Yeah.
But don't you think part of the problem is actually deciding what a healthy economy is?
That's a good question, yeah.
Because if we believe it's a growth model, that's a sign of health, doesn't that lead us to some of the things that Pope Francis is talking about in terms of consumption and degradation of the environment?
Yeah, it depends, right? It always depends. That how much if growth is great, growth is important, but how much growth, right? And if the paradigm is more growth is always better, which is the presumption, right? More growth is always better. Then the more growth can mean trampling people's dignity underfoot. So yeah, I mean, essentially you're right. what is growth, what does health mean for an economy? And I think what the professors seem to suggest is that health is defined by the kind of growth that doesn't take into account its effect on family, effect on people, and so on. Yes?
Just a quick comment on that. One notorious American environmentalist coined the phrase, ideology. Unlimited growth is the ideology of the cancer cell.
Yes, yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah, but yet that is one of the assumptions often of modern economic theory.
Yes.
So it doesn't necessarily need to be the assumption, but that is often the assumption. But yeah, that's what a cancer cell does. It just grows
Yeah.
and grows and grows
Without any
without any constraint or restraint
Exactly.
or limit.
Exactly.
Until it kills the system that's growing.
Precise.
Maybe one more question.
Yes.
I was interested in how the Vatican actually gave you information
Yeah.
before it came out. There's some talking points. You know, I wonder, do you think we're going to get better at that? As you know, because this was a few years ago when I was thinking my mom was, I don't know, her late 80s or whatever, and when Pope Francis talking about who am I to judge, and it was regarding a same-sex couple. And my mom was like, the Kalamazoo Gazette basically twisted it. The lesbian, gay, transvestite community basically said, see, Catholics don't believe in the sacrament of marriage anymore. It's, you know, anything goes. And the whole article was like that.
Right.
And I'd love to say it was the only newspaper that did it, but it was very, very common. And I just wonder if they're going to get better at getting it out quicker. No, the Catholic Church believes in the sanctity of marriage.
Yeah,
And
I
they
think
don't
this,
believe anything's a marriage.
right, yeah, no, I think that that's a few things to say. One is, I mean, just quickly, no, right? I don't think we're going to get better in that because the church isn't, the church isn't a Fortune 500 company that has people that manage communications in the same way that other companies, other organizations do. We're bad at it. I mean, the Vatican is not good at it in the American context, but the church is the church for the whole world. In one very real way, the church doesn't exist to try to manage media. That's a hard thing to say when we live in a culture that is driven by media, and when sometimes the conversion of my child is dependent upon what they pick up in the media. So I don't say that triumphantly or cavalierly. I think it's fact. Now, in the past, the church has been better about dealing with that because the popes who've been pope have been more cautious and more reserved in the things they say. Pope Francis, and I recommend you reading the biography by Austin Ivory called The Great Reformer. It's a really great biography. But one of the things I discovered in that book was that the Pope Francis, when he was in Buenos Aires, never talked to the media. He made a point of it. He didn't like talking to the media. He had a priest who would do that for him. That's why that guy Father Marco was there to talk to the media for him. And Father Marco said that the Holy Father had spoken more times in the media in the first 3 months of his pontificate than he did in 18 years in Buenos Aires. So this is new to the Holy Father. And the way he communicates is the way he communicates with the people in the barrios in Buenos Aires, in a very frank, in a very real way. And when he communicates, he doesn't have theological constructs in his head or the way the media might twist it. He's thinking of a person. He's thinking of somebody he had a conversation with, and that's who he's talking to. Which is a sign, I think, of just how environmentally corrupt our conversation is in the media. That somebody can't have that personal conversation with somebody else without it being twisted. So it's a sign of our environmental and human degradation when that happens. But my hope, and the hope of many people who work for the church in the United States and elsewhere, is that we'll get better at being able to tell our side of the story and have more opportunities to do that, and that we never give up telling that story. So on many occasions, I've tried to give the rest of the context of that particular comment and so many others, so that people understand that that they can really depend on the church to provide them with the truth that they've always been brought with.
Yeah, that was tough because, you know, here my mom's an elderly person and she's reading this, knowing
Yeah.
it's not true.
Yeah.
But she's asking me, what really did he say and what
Right.
was it really about?
Right. Yeah. I know it's frustrating. And when I won't say which comment it was, but there was a comment recently, and I was, we were already getting phone calls in the chancery, and people were angry about this and that other thing, and I was struggling to find just somewhere on the internet, anywhere, the actual comments by the Holy Father. It was almost impossible to find. From the Vatican website or from anywhere, I couldn't get what he actually said. And by that time, in the American cycle, it's too late. It's already out.
One other thing, have you seen the Jesuits program Dating God, that they talk about the encyclical?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, and I found that it was very good from the standpoint that it went right back and addressed some of the issues of creation and, you know, and the different forms that, you know, we were, you know, what's made us think that we can continue to pilfer and, you know, take over the resources, and, you know, you shall subdue and, you know, take over. You know,
Right, yes.
that those things were meant in a different way, so. And I think there's a series of 6 or 8 of them, you know, and I think they're gonna do some more.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. I found it by going to Dating God. It's
Okay.
a little unusual, but.
Yeah. Just a little. They're Jesuits.
Just a little.
Well, God bless you. Thank you so much for coming out this evening.